Hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Janecki at the Duke University Libraries Technical Services, and I'll be your on-camera moderator for this session. This is the second lightning round, session 2A, and I'm just going to let the participants introduce themselves. And so we're going to start off with Paula.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paula Damasceno. I am the Multimedia Instruction Coordinator at the UNC Greensboro Jackson Library Digital Media Commons and a Chapel Hill SILS candidate at the master with a master's in science and library science. And so you said everyone will introduce ourselves, or should I start my presentation? I'm sorry.
Oh, you can go ahead and start, and then
all right. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Here we are. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. As I said, I'm Paula Damasceno, and I also have a BFA granted by the University of Greensboro, and I am presenting today on a digital exhibition I have made for my master project at SILS at Chapel Hill. And it's called Inclassificáveis, and translated from Portuguese to English, it means unclassifiables. It is about, it displays items from UNC Chapel Hill Library's collections on Cordéis, which are mini small pamphlets, zines, comics, and artist books. I had a whole other idea of my master project that involved field work in Brazil, but COVID gave me a shutdown, and so I had to move on to another idea. And the idea started by I reached out to Alice Whiteside, the Sloan Art Librarian, head of the Sloan Art Library, to know more about Latin American and specifically Brazilian publications in their collections. And from there, she introduced me to Teresa Chapa, who is the Iberian, Latin American, and Latinx librarian at Davis Library, Graduate Library. And then Teresa introduced me to the Wilson Special Collections. And from these three libraries, I selected items from to include in that exhibition. That at the time I was pursuing a dual degree in art history and library science, and therefore I wanted to merge both of them in one project. I ended up just with the library science, although I had multiple hours credits in art history. And I decided to focus my digital exhibition to base it on a specific user group. And they are artists and artist students, information, behavior, practices, and needs. I've had the wonderful help of Kenyatta McDonald, who works here at the Digital Media Commons, but just applied to SILS to pursue her master's degree. And so she helped me. And now the next step will be to move that exhibition to the Carolina Digital Repository. And so I wanted to give that intro to reinforce how important was collaboration for me in this, right? Without all this, I could not have done so. So the project became a conscious archival description, culturally aware organizational system, user-specific based project. And next. So to be able to build a sound digital exhibition that was based not only on previous studies made about the information behavior of artists and art students, I also included digital humanities literature review, just to discuss what are the definitions that we have so far as digital humanists and librarians have got to it. Of course, there is, most of you know that there is no consensus about a fixed definition of digital humanities. And so I wanted to discuss that to support my argument that a better digital exhibition, to be considered as sound digital humanities, should use interdisciplinary, collaborative, and intersectional digital humanity practices to build then an accessible and contextualized digital exhibition that takes in consideration the differences between making a digital exhibition or a digital humanities project with visual sources rather than textual sources. And that's what the visual turn is within the digital humanities field. And then finally, I discussed the implications of the librarianship work in building digital exhibitions, in participating in digital humanities projects. Finally, I did a brief commentary on Latin American collections in the US and how I aligned these digital exhibitions, this digital exhibition with previous practices that claim for more intersectionality, more cultural aware content. So for example, I have here videos from social network and groups that are not academic, but that do discuss the same content of a specific comics that is in the exhibition. So this way I also could, having a rich literature review, I could also create a fields for the art and artist students information needs, like they do need inspiration for their work. They want to know how to do it, the more information about the craft. And so that's what they are for. And at the same time, I added here, for example, where to find other collections in the US honoring the collaborative aspect of Latin American collections in the US. So the methodology was to adapt information needs to a taxonomy schema. Then I researched, I selected, I curated, I repeated that process multiple times, highlighting that selection and curation are two different things. And to curate, I needed, again, to contextualize the items. So that's, to me, was important because I have seen very good digital exhibitions and not so good. And the difference between them is the quality of the contextualization of the items. I've made some visual documentation. I photographed items, but I also used already photographed items that had already been photographed and scanned. And again, the libraries helped me a lot with that. Some graphic design to also address the need for a visually compelling exhibition according to the information needs of artists and art students. Copyrights and headings cleared with Davis Library as well, addition of metadata. Translation, I just accomplished to do a little bit, and assessment and pedagogical programming is something that I address on my paper, as well as educational programming as a step to be taken in the future. Here is just a visual aid to show the categories that I was able to create within the exhibition. So those 3 links I have passed along. The presentation is also on Hoover, and these 2 links are, first of all, my master paper, where you can have access to the bibliography and the literature review discussions and more in-depth discussion of the methodology. The digital exhibition now is part of the Tar Heels Life. I'm graduating in May, so I will move it out of UNCG to the digital repository. I'm sorry, out of the UNC Tar Heels WordPress page to the digital repository. And so this final link is for you to please let me know if you have interest in knowing how to access the digital exhibition after we move it out Tar Heels Live. And I guess I stopped to share, but I will just for a second show here the digital exhibition itself. It has a couple of words on, again, about conceptualization of the whole exhibition and the title of it, just a title that goes against the grain of fixed national identities. And then the 4 main categories within the exhibition, some tags, for example, here that the blue tag is a tag that I was able to add according to the needs of artists and art students to search for colors, as well as a sort of inspiration, as a source of inspiration. And I guess that's it for my 9 minutes. I'm sorry. And thank you for being here. And I'll be glad to answer any questions later.
Thanks so much. People, if you have questions in the audience, you can put them in the Whovid chat and we'll get to them at the end of everyone's presentations. Sophie, you're up next.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And here we are. All righty. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sophie Hollis, and I'm a master's student at the UNC Chapel Hill School of Information and Library Science as well. I'm also a graduate assistant at the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center, which means that I help digitize materials from around the state of North Carolina to make them accessible online. And it's this work at the Digital Heritage Center, as well as my classes at UNC, that it got me interested in the topic that I want to talk about today, which is figuring out the ethical framework around what kinds of archival materials should be put online. And today I want to start a conversation about what consent should look like for some of the trickiest materials, and that's what I'm calling sexual materials. So I just want to put a quick warning out. This presentation does make reference to the existence of sex and gender-based violence, so please prioritize your own well-being if needed. Okay, so for the purposes of this presentation, I'm thinking about sexual materials as sort of an umbrella term for several things. So first, that could mean pornography and erotica, or materials that have descriptions or photographs of sex. I'm actually not going to talk much about this category today, sorry, but I include it here because I think this is a category of materials that's important to preserve, and it may fall into the framework that I'm proposing. The second category is sexual materials that include depictions, descriptions, or references to sex and/or gender-based violence. This is the category that I tend to think about the most because these kinds of materials have the potential to do a lot of harm, and whether that's to a user who interacts with them or the person that's being depicted in the materials. I feel like there's an argument to be made here about the kind of ongoing harm of the survivor of the violence that happens when people look at these materials, even if that person is deceased. So I think this is a topic that deserves particular thought and care, but luckily it's not a category of materials that I personally have to work with much. So that kind of brings me to the third category that I have here, which is materials related to sexual orientation. Now, obviously this category kind of overlaps with the previous two, specifically the porn and erotica, but I'm raising it as its own entity here because I think it can provide us with some helpful examples for figuring out digitization best practices. So the key question when it comes to these materials is about how to balance our duties as librarians to provide access with our duty to respect privacy and to mitigate harm. So many archives work with materials that were accessioned before the internet was like a conceivable entity. So when donors initially consented to have those materials accessible to researchers, it wasn't the same as consenting for those materials to be available to anyone anywhere as they would be if they were put online. So this is thinking about how we can determine whether it's okay to put sexual materials into a digital collection. So the first thing to do would be to determine whether we can get clear consent. In some cases, the creators and the subjects of materials are still alive, so we can reach out to them directly, which is like great, the easiest thing to do. So for most archival materials, though, creators and subjects are likely deceased. So in that case, we can turn to a framework that's built on the idea of radical empathy that was proposed by Michelle Caswell and Marika Safour, where we consider the context of the acquisition and how its digitization would affect these four key parties. So that's the materials creators, the subjects, the users, and the larger community surrounding the collection. So the purpose of this would be to move away from the pure like time capsule model that we sometimes use, where we wait a certain number of years before we make sensitive materials accessible. Because in some instances, especially when we're talking about materials with sex and gender-based violence, a time-sensitive embargo won't negate the harm that those materials can do. So we need to think about some other solutions. So here I have a quote from Radical Empathy in the Archives that I think kind of sums up this idea. It says, an archival approach marked by radical empathy would require archives to make survivors and implicated communities, not just a target group of users, but a central focus point in all aspects of the archival endeavor, from appraisal to description to provision of access. And I'm the one that added the bolding there. So essentially what this is saying is that the practice of radical empathy asks us to weigh the benefits of making sexual materials in archives public versus the harm that they might potentially cause. So in most instances, the stakeholders that are most likely to experience harm are going to be the subjects of the materials and the users. So those are the groups that I'm arguing we're going to need to prioritize. So in the case of subjects, that might mean thinking about what access is appropriate. And for users, that might mean putting advanced warnings on materials with graphic or upsetting content. So to turn to a real example, let's look at the front page, which is an LGBTQ newspaper that ran in Raleigh, North Carolina, before it merged with the Charlotte Paper Q Notes. So the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center digitized several issues of Q Notes through a partnership with Duke University and UNC Charlotte. And those are the universities that house most of the issues. And so then later, Duke and UNC Charlotte came back and said, we'd really love to digitize issues of the front page as well. But this newspaper has different publishers and editors than Q Notes. So it turned into the situation where Lisa Gregory, the program director at NCDHC, felt compelled to seek out consent. So in this case, determining consent was made exponentially easier through collaboration with Duke and UNC Charlotte, because they had an established relationship with the front page publishers and editors. So they were able to provide that clear guidance on what they were comfortable with. And they were already excited to digitize, so that was great news for us. But still, since newspapers include so many subjects, like the people in the photographs or in the articles, Lisa determined that the best path forward would be to start with just a small run of the newspapers. That way, if another interested party had an objection, that they would be easy to take down. We also put a clear mechanism on the website where people could report harmful content and request that materials be taken down. And luckily, we don't get many of those, so we're able to look at them on sort of a case-by-case basis and address them as they come up. Sometimes that results in removing full text searching or scrubbing out individual names so that they don't pop up on Google searches. Sometimes that results in taking down materials completely. Thankfully, this has not happened for the front page for us yet, but those are some of the safety mechanisms that we have in place to make sure that we have that ongoing cooperation with living stakeholders. So clearly it takes a little bit of extra effort, but I do think there are ways to determine consent to ethically digitize archival materials. Beyond this issue of consent, though, is what to do with the materials once they enter the digital realm. So how we organize sexual materials, like what language and what authorities we're using, this presents another problem. So moving forward, I'd really like to think more about how we use ethical metadata to organize these materials and whether our existing systems are sufficient for this. This is an area that I'd really love to explore more in the future. So I hope this opens up a wider conversation about how we can be responsible stewards of archival materials at all phases of the process of digitization. So here's some of the literature that I based today's presentation on. And that's it from me. Thank you so much for your time. And here's my contact information if anybody is interested in reaching out.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Gary, you're up next.
Thank you so much. I'm Gary Childs. I'm the engineering or STEM H librarian at Westchester University. A lot of folks ask me what the H happens to stand for. That's health. So I cover a huge amount of topic areas here at the university. And to start with some background, when I began, there were two new academic programs that had recently received approval, which were the physician assistant and biomedical engineering programs, with the student cohorts arriving in fall of 2021. The program directors happened to already be in place. They were actively recruiting faculty at that point, and the subject librarian, me, surprise, surprise, was hired in spring of 2020, and resources for these programs needed to be acquired. They really had quite a different impact in terms of topic area for what we had already collected here at the university. And of course, right after this, 2 months passed since my onboarding, and all of a sudden the pandemic hit. The university had to rapidly pivot to remote offerings at that point. That was the decision they made. And all students and faculty were entirely remote, which includes all of the subject librarians. We anticipated a budget reduction, and we assumed some decreased student population. However, if you happen to be familiar with the physician assistant programs across the US, they are extremely competitive. So that was one area that I knew we weren't going to see a student dip. We were going to get a large amount of applications for this. Luckily, we were undergoing an examination of some licensed resources just prior to the pandemic arriving. But we had a lot of work to do. And we needed to demonstrate the need for these resources to individuals that are not part of the library and are not part of the academic program. And even going across library units at this point was going to be challenging. Certainly, being a subject librarian, I could talk about this a great deal, but I had to coordinate really very closely with our electronic resources librarians. At this point, I started working very closely with the program directors in those specific units to identify 5 peer and 5 aspirational universities. We wanted to build a benchmarking plan so we could try to demonstrate the need for these resources across a variety of different, really different locations, different specializations, and of course, also to university administration. To do this, we solidified a list of subject-specific resources in which the program directors could say, okay, these are nice to have versus these are essential. And we also developed a 3-year phased acquisition plan. That way we could get the resources in a just-in-time manner, if everything worked all right. And just a good example of how this looked. Obviously, color coding was very important here. So you could see Westchester being compared against some peer institutions as well as some aspirational institutions. And these are being compared in terms of access to different resources such as ASTM Compass, Engineering Village, Medline. We did this for journals as well, and we're able to be very specific about coverage years. That was very helpful too. Now, I did have to redact pricing from the slides. That, of course, is very important. Sadly, these slides look a little bare without that. But from here, you can see some of the journals that we identified and databases, and these are specific to our physician assistant program. What truly helped was building these fiscal year estimates. That phased approach was gigantic for us. This was also something that could be submitted by the programs to their accrediting bodies. Unfortunately, you see a large amount of redaction here as well, but you can see how these resources have been identified and how we're also estimating for potential inflation. I think estimating for 5% inflation was a good idea. By doing that yearly, that was very, very helpful and gave us some good target numbers to be aware of. And this led to some very helpful outcomes. Because of these estimates, we're able to see that additional funding wasn't needed during fiscal year 2022, but we are seeking additional funding for fiscal year 2023. That's currently going, those discussions are currently happening right now. And this has really led to regular resource conversations with program directors, university administration, and also between internal library committees, arguing for funding, especially if we have to potentially discuss something something as difficult as saying, hey, we need to potentially cancel a resource in another area in order to properly fund something else that's necessary is a hard discussion. So having this type of chart is very helpful. That benchmarking data has been just immensely important for all of these conversations that we're having. This is used really to demonstrate this need at other levels as well. We have a university curriculum committee that meets to discuss program development and adding new programs to the university. We were able to use these sort of documents to really get across the idea of pricing and how much journals actually cost to non-librarians. That was essential for us. They've now understood this need and are approaching the library in a much different fashion when they're looking at the approval of new programs. Granted, the approval of new programs has slowed down based on COVID-19, so that of course being understandable, but now we've altered the model. So the form that's being filled out by this curriculum committee also has to be run by the library. So we can say, are there gaps in the collection in this area, or is this something we can easily approve and say, yes, go ahead with this. We have the resources to support that program. So this has worked out really nicely for us, but we're still at the beginning stages of this. I think one of the things that we're learning right now and trying to really grasp hold of is making sure that the program directors are also speaking to the deans. That's one of the things that we still need to address and I think do a better job with, but making sure that they communicate those needs to their specific deans is also helpful for individuals such as the provost understanding those wants. And at this point, I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to our next speaker.
All right. Yes, thank you so much, Gary. It's Kerry and Wenli are next.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon. My name is Kerry Creelman, and I am presenting with Wenli Gao from the University of Houston Libraries. Wenli is getting our slides up and sharing.
Because this thing, sorry, the thing blocked this. Is there another way to share? Oh. So I should, yeah. Okay, sorry.
There we go. All right. So we're here to talk to you today a little bit about our project where we've reviewed collections policies from ARL member institutions. We'll tell you a little bit about us, about our methodology, our results, and some of the conclusions that we drew. The University of Houston is a large state Research One institution, and we have more than 46,000 students, more than 50 full-time librarians, and 100 staff. We recently restructured our library staffing, resulting in a new collection strategies and services department with functional specialists dedicated to collection strategies and analysis. As part of that restructure, all of our subject liaisons, with the exception of those in our branch libraries, were reclassified to functional specialist positions. Our new team is considering the collection holistically rather than by subject area. And we are all responsible we're all responsible for effective stewardship of the budget through policies, guidelines, and decisions. So as we undertake a more programmatic and collaborative approach to collections, we want a broad enterprise-wide document that clearly articulates our philosophy and priorities so that our stakeholders in and out of the library can find, read, and understand our values. And this isn't a document that we currently have, so this is something that we are in the process of creating. That document should guide our decision-making related to collections across the library. So anyone, whether it's our art and architecture library or our collections team, they'll have a collections plan that directly ties back to the priorities identified in our collection policy. The plan or policy will be rooted in campus needs and will help facilitate better communication with faculty and other campus stakeholders. We want to make this public and be able to demonstrate accountability to our plan and discuss that with our stakeholders. So to develop this collection plan or policy, we turned to other ARL libraries to see what we liked and what we wanted to emulate. And Wenli will tell you a little bit about our methodology.
So the list for ARL member institutions was retrieved from the ARL website in October 2021, including 125 member institutions. Each member institution was assigned a type: academic, public, or special. Since the purpose for this project was to investigate collections policies in academic libraries, public libraries and special libraries were excluded. One Canadian academic library website was in French, so we also excluded that. After the list was created, we went to these websites and looked for specific pages for collection services or department webpage. If they were not available, we went to the library's About Us page and looked for policy sections to see if there were pages relating to collections. Finally, we checked the bottom of the library page for policy if no collection policy page were found in previous 2 steps. After collection information pages were found, we assigned a type of policy. 14 types were assigned, such as budget, collection development, and textbook policies. Finally, if the page contains detailed information, we put yes in the recommended column to indicate a suggestion for reference for the future. All of these information were compiled into a spreadsheet and organized in a way that would allow easy filtering. Here are the 14 types of policies and their definition. For example, budget is about the library's collections budget or budget transparency. We investigated 116 academic libraries in English, and about 40% has no collections policies page on their websites. A total of 133 collections policies page were found. Most of the libraries had a general collections page that include multiple collections related statement or policy. Some had specific pages on various aspects of collection issues. You can see the types of policies by count on this page. A lot of libraries have collection development policies. Some libraries also include topics on open access and DEI on their websites. Here are some limitations for this project. First, the searches on these websites were done manually and would have human error. There's a possibility that some pages were missing because of the hidden nature of these pages. Moreover, we did not go outside of the library website to look for specific policies. In some cases, data acquisition policy may be under a data research guide. For the sake of time, we did not search pages outside of these or outside of the library main page. Types of policies were assigned based on our knowledge. It was not categorized based on any previous study. Finally, the recommendation was simply a way to note pages we would like to go back in the future. It was a subjective process. As links changed, we rechecked them in April 2022 and found 4 broken links. Regular link checking is recommended. Besides, more information such as location, budget, and library size could be added so that librarians could easily find their peer institutions. Moreover, the scope of this project is academic libraries from ARL member institutions. More libraries could be added to expand this project and make it more inclusive. Finally, it is time-consuming for 1 or 2 people to collect policy pages. There could be a committee to call for submission and maintain a collections policies bank. Here is the link to the policies we find. As you can see, about 40% of academic libraries has no collections policies page on their website. There is a need for more public-facing collections policies. Furthermore, there could be collective efforts to build and maintain a collections policies bank for the broader library community to learn from each other. If policies represent institutional priorities and values, sharing these more broadly and publicly would allow us to come to shared understandings on where we stand on professional issues related to collections and scholarly publishing, which could facilitate further collaboration and communication across institutions. Thank you for attending our session, and we are happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you to our panelists. Those were some wonderful presentations. All right, so the first question is for Gary. Was any funding given by the university when they first approved the new programs? And if so, is that on an ongoing basis or for a limited one-time basis?
No, we received no additional funding from the university administration when these programs were initially set up. That's one of the huge reasons that led to the implementation of this project, to really get across those ideas and make them much more clear to our partners across the university itself.
Okay, the next question is for Paula. What would you like to see happen next with this collection?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. For the next step for that exhibition is to move it from WordPress to the digital repository. And from there, what we want to do is to make it accessible to, especially for Latin American studies departments and Brazilian studies departments and art departments. And then to have some options for educational programming that are posted within the digital exhibition as well. So just because the question has collections in it, I want to clarify that the digital exhibition mixes collections from 3 different libraries within UNC Chapel Hill: Sloan Art Library, Davis Graduate Library, and Wilson Special Collections. Does it answer the question?
Oh, yes, that was very helpful. And a follow-up question. How did you scope the exhibit? And was there anything that you couldn't include because of rights or technical limitations?
I had no limitations in terms of copyrights because the items were acquired within that caveat that they could make the items accessible. And so the digital exhibition is purely for educational purposes. So I had no problems with that whatsoever. And then what was the second question? I'm sorry. Within the how did you scope the exhibit? Yes, the scope of the exhibition. So I really went back to the very basic concept of unclassifiables, which is a song from the 90s from a very known poet in Brazil who comes from a lineage of concrete poetry, and that has questioned the idea of fixed identity of Brazilians in general. And it's a song whose title, which the title is Unclassifiables, right? So do not try to classify us. We are too big of a melting pot. We are also questioning the very nature of classification with it. So I had to go back to that and relate the items that I selected to it to be able to cut out some. So, but even then, of course, because of that, I felt at times uncomfortable leaving out something that could really be useful. But in addition to that, another main scope strategy to define the scope of the exhibition was, this is just a access portal. So the exhibition is not meant to exhibit it's not meant to invite people to just relate to the items in the exhibition, but as a portal for people to then dive in deeper into the huge and rich collections of Brazilian artist books, comics, zines, and Cordéis at UNC Chapel Hill. So in that sense, it was like, I will give you a little appetizer of what a whole feast can be if you get to that exhibition.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Sophie. You mentioned removing full text searching to keep some front page materials out of Google searches. However, OCR can be an important accessibility feature. Are you able to block individual items from web crawlers, or do you have to turn scans into flat PDFs?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point. I don't think that we actually have used like getting rid of the full text readability on the front page specifically. I think that came up with like a different newspaper that was a little bit before my time, so I don't know the full story. But yeah, I totally agree. We try to make as much as possible. Like typically the standard is for them to be full text readable and searchable to be maximally accessible. And so if we need to remove that, we typically just have it as like we typically just use like an image file, like a TIFF that doesn't have that isn't partnered with a full text reader. But we almost never do that and try to avoid it as much as possible.
Okay, thanks. And now a question for Wenli and Kerry. When you were evaluating collection development policies you found online, were policies assigned to a single category, or did you find policies that included multiple categories of information about the collections?
So thank you for the question. So if the page contains multiple topics, it was assigned as the category as general. The general categories means it has different sections for one page, had different sections for different topics. Then if a page has only one topic, then it's categorized for just one category.
Okay. And a follow-up question for Gary. When you were doing your assessment of resources available for new programs, was there much overlap between resources that you needed and resources that you already had access to?
I would say without an exact percentage, that's always a difficult question. But in terms of journals, we certainly did have some overlap, but I would say we really were trying to acquire probably about 70% new material in many cases, really trying to outreach for that. Yeah, so this is expensive, and we're trying to really illustrate this case again to really university level leadership. Lucky to be having some conversations with the provost at this point. But wow, yeah, communication is always the challenging piece. Just being able to get those 5 minutes is key. So going out and being able to do that, being able to pound the door and seeing if I can get into a room is huge. The report itself won't do it. It's also having those convincing arguments when you get in the door. And yeah, just realizing more communication needs to occur at some certain levels.
Well, I'm glad that this was able to give you good talking points for when you had the chance to approach administrators. And if anybody else has questions, please pop them in the chat right now. Otherwise, we will wrap up shortly. And just a reminder to everyone that the sessions are being recorded, and recordings of presentations will be made available to registrants. Don't have a definite timeline of when that's going to happen, but it will happen relatively soon. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I think that we can wrap this up. Thank you so much to our presenters.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.